what do you think separates literature and gives literature power that is separate from other creative endeavors? So that is separate from film, that is separate from because and you kind of the reason this podcast even got scheduled was because you had kind of put that question out onto Facebook, and I interpreted it because you said, "What's the power of literature in your mind?" And I interpreted it specifically through the lens of saying, "Well, it's if it's not film, what's different about storytelling via the different mediums?" And so I'm wondering, from your perspective, given the different mediums, what is the specific power that literature has that maybe other mediums don't have?
Well, I wouldn't make those distinctions.
Mm,
So I would think of it a little differently. So I think that the those so film, I love movies, and I think they have they have some of the same powers that literature has.
mm,
So let's just if we just take the film, let's compare films and novels. I love both of them. But so literature is often harder than those other genres.
mm,
Let's just be honest about it, because if you're going to read a Faulkner now, I love William Faulkner, The
mm,
Sound of the Fury, all these great novels that he wrote, Light in August, and I teach those, and so they tell a story, they do what a film does. They're harder to read. He's using
mm,
all these techniques, these narrative techniques. There's a depth to it. There all the things. It's harder, but there is a payoff
mm,
to that effort that it takes. So it's a different experience than you get with the film.
mm,
I value both of them. They're both in the same realm, but there is something about reading, for me at least, I love Faulkner. There's something about reading one of those novels that takes me to a deeper psychological,
mm,
spiritual, existential level than I can get in a movie.
mm.
So there's a payoff to that effort to get to that depth, but it's harder to access it.
Interesting. Interesting. That's a really interesting perspective. Um, I have one example of how I believe that could be the case, and then a question about maybe a question about how the functionality may be slightly different. So because one of the things I've noticed between one of the things I commented on that Facebook post that you put out was that there's a unique function of that literature has that is almost impossible to capture. Now, when I'm saying literature, other prose can capture it, other fictional prose can capture it, maybe even non-fictional prose can capture it. But like a film can't capture it. Not really. Films have tried to capture it, but they just can't. And that is again being inside the thought process, being inside the head of the character. Because in a film, people have tried to do that, and it never really comes off quite right. One of the powers of film that maybe literature can evoke the visual stimulus, the visual stimuli. Like it can evoke visuals, but film just gives you the visuals, right? So it's a very visual medium. Whereas with literature, you could say, okay, well, in film, I'm going to have the main character narrate stuff to you, right? But it almost feels like in the film community, especially, that would be seen as like, oh, that's kind of a cheat. And it's like, you could just show it to us visually. They don't have to say it to us in their heads, Um, and I'll give you an example of what I think that equates to, given what you were saying about like where something is a little bit more difficult to to work through. Have you ever? I assume that you haven't, but have you ever read Game of Thrones or watched the Game of Thrones series?
No, I haven't.
Okay, I didn't think so. So I won't do any spoilers or anything for those people who haven't seen it. But I read the first two books first. And the first two books are, if I remember correctly, yeah, they are third person perspective, but they follow different characters. And so in that third person, it is omniscient, so we can understand what the characters are experiencing, what they're kind of feeling as they go through these. And it's meant to be, the whole Game of Thrones series is meant to be sort of like a fantasy version of what the Middle Ages were like for people living in that time period. And they are horrific. there are there are so many depraved things happening to multiple people. And I read the first two books, and I stopped after the end of the second book. And this is not me necessarily arguing that they should be considered literature, but more so that that the format of them is similar to literature. It shares things with literature because because it's prose and it's fiction. And I could not read anymore after the second book because I went, this is literally causing me to be depressed. And I'm not usually affected like that, even with books or anything. But I was like, every single thing that happens to these people is horrific, and I can almost feel it because I'm inside the minds of these characters. I can
Mhm.
see what's happening to them, and I feel it being horrible. There are incestuous relationships. There's child abuse. It's very, very intense. So then the TV show comes out, and a bunch of my friends are telling me how great the TV show is. And I'm thinking to myself, like, how could you say the TV show is great? Because I mean, like, if it shows what I think it shows, that's crazy. But eventually I was convinced to watch the TV show, and I realized something from the very first episode that I was watching. And that was I wasn't inside the minds of the characters anymore
Mm. Mhm.
because I was now removed as a viewer. I could not get into their minds. I could watch over their shoulder, but it wasn't omniscient. And when I'm watching them over their shoulder, I also have other things going on inside my head. This
Mhm.
character who was meant to be 14 years old is portrayed by someone who's 25.
Mm.
These two people in an incestuous relationship are clearly actors who are not brother and sister, father and whatever. So it was a very like I found that the series was much easier for me to watch without getting this heavy weight feeling than it was to read the actual book. And so there's something I think in the power of literature that is it's almost like there's an inseparability between your response to what's going through your brain prompted by the words on the page versus what's prompted by visuals on a screen. And so
Yes.
I wonder if you had any comment on that in terms of how that works.
Yes, I think that's a big important difference. And that's what I guess that's what I mean by the idea of payoff.
Mm.
So you're talking about it in a negative sense, in a way that,
Right.
that book was so horrific that you didn't want to be in the minds of those people anymore. If you kind of turn that upside down and think about in a positive way what happens with literature, I'm planning a section in the book called the books you need, finding the
Mm.
books you need.
Mm.
And for people who love literature like I do, there are certain times when I need to read Thomas Wolfe. I
Mm.
need to enter into that world. Psychologically, I feel that need because there's something in there that when I read it, I think, yes, this is true. This is reality. And it's not the reality I'm living, but it's reality in some other way. There's a depth to it, and it's hard to describe,
Mm.
but but and there are different books that I need, different authors I need at different moments in life.
Mm.
Those are the types of things I'm trying to get at in the book. And what I would say is I'm not trying to pull people away from the other genres. I'm not saying, read literature instead of watching the films, read literature instead of video games. Understand the value of those. What I'm really asking of readers is experience those other things, but don't write off literature.
Mm.
I think that's what a lot of people have done. That's what a lot of my students have done on the first day they've come to class.
Mm.
They have had a bad experience. at some point with literature, maybe a teacher that they didn't like or something like that, or they just weren't mature enough for it or something. And they've just decided, I'm not a reader. I don't like literature. Well, I try to get them to reconsider that. Maybe you were too hasty when you made that decision. Let's try it again. Let's enter into this again
Mm.
and think of it in a new way. And often it works. They even with specific works that they've read before, we'll read them again and they say, this seems so good now. I used to hate this.
Mm.
Why does it seem so good? They're different people than they were
Mm.
before. So
That's
that's
awesome.
I try to invite them into that.
Well, and saying they're different people than they were before is that's power. I mean, if you can change a perspective, if you can change a behavior, if you can change a thought process, that is really, really powerful, particularly in today's world.